Ghislain's outrageous string of antics had, inevitably, brought him back into her presence. She stood still, her voice cold and clipped as she demanded to know why he had entered her room without permission. With an unfaltering calm and the soft cadence of sincerity, Ghislain responded. He conveyed that he had come with the purpose of curing her, a bold claim delivered with conviction. Since she had already tested the cosmetic he had crafted, he asked if it had produced any noticeable improvement on her afflicted skin. Rosalind offered no answer. Instead, her silence transformed into rage as she hurled the jar at his face with all the spite she could muster. He shifted ever so slightly, letting the jar fly past without harm. Her anger was justified, he thought, but he also knew that dragging her through the hellish treatment he had known was the only way to deliver her from the torment she endured. No gentle path would lead her to salvation. She dropped to her knees, fury lacing her voice as she screamed that he was not the first to make such lofty promises. Others had tried before, each proclaiming certainty, each failing. She no longer cared about the cure or the healer. The medicine, the methods, none of it mattered anymore. All she desired was for him to leave her be, convinced that hope was a cruel illusion she could no longer afford. Ghislain's resolve didn't waver. He spoke again, this time with sterner weight in his tone, asserting that he was not like the others. He was prepared to gamble his life for the sake of her recovery. That declaration only incited her further. Turning her back, she raged that such words were always the same. Greedy men disguised as saviors, all claiming they were different, all swearing upon their lives. Yet none stayed, none endured. It meant nothing to her that Ghislain's cosmetic was selling across the kingdom. In her eyes, he was no different, a liar like the rest. Still, Ghislain remained unmoved, quietly conveying his understanding. He acknowledged that her pain had run deep, built upon years of betrayal and crushed expectations. Inwardly, his thoughts turned to who Rosalind truly was. A noble woman with the blood of two of the kingdom's most powerful lines. Her father, the uncompromising leader of the royalist faction, and her mother, the brilliant daughter of the chancellor. After the death of her mother, Rosalind Bramford had become the unshakable pillar of her house. She was not merely beautiful or well-born. She was a prodigy in her own right. A master of both pen and sword, she wielded elegance and intellect in equal measure. She was grace and fire, a force to be reckoned with, and all of it achieved while still in the flower of youth. At a remarkably young age, she mastered channeling mana through the blade while establishing herself as a foremost patron of Cardea's varied industries. Contracts, workshops, and guilds bore her seal, and the map of commerce brightened wherever her attention settled. Then an unknown skin disease overturned that carefully built life completely, replacing audiences with physicians and salons with shuttered rooms. Isolation grew where reputation had once flourished, and rumors trailed the silence like smoke. The Marquis family, armed with wealth and influence, pursued every possible remedy. Nothing worked. As desperation mounted, her father looked to secure her future through a political marriage. She could no longer live as the dazzling star she had once been. But at the very least, the Bramford name could still provide shelter. Her condition was no ordinary ailment. It was a consequence of a rare, catastrophic reaction caused by misaligned training in mana cultivation. The balance between positive and negative mana, known as the polarities, had collapsed, disrupting her mana road entirely. The eruption that followed left scars beyond the surface. And now, as she stood once more before hollow promises and uncertain hope, Rosalind chose fury. She raised her sword, raw mana surging from her body in reckless waves, and lunged toward Ghislain, threatening to kill him if he didn't leave that very instant. But Ghislain, with a softness that betrayed no fear, apologized. He explained that he would now have to proceed by force, not out of cruelty, but because he understood that her use of mana in such a chaotic state would only exacerbate her illness further. Before she could continue her rampage, Ghislain sprang into motion. With startling speed, he closed the distance, drawing his sword in preparation to counter her strike. Rosalind's eyes widened in disbelief at his agility. Even so, she brought her blade down, intending to cleave him in two. But Ghislain's sword was already there, its hilt intercepting hers with practiced precision. In that instant, He pushed forward, overpowering her, disarming her momentum, and seizing her arm with unyielding grip. In one seamless motion, he spun and slammed her to the floor, subduing her flailing form. He wasted no time calling for Belinda and Wendy to come aid in restraining her. Within seconds, the two attendants stormed into the room, bringing a mattress as instructed, following their lord's command without hesitation. Working with practiced efficiency, Belinda and Wendy bound Rosalind to the bed before further thrashing could worsen the delicate condition. Rage continued to pour through her, and she demanded release at once, while Claude entered to support Ghislain in the attempt to effect a cure. Before any procedure could begin, Ghislain indicated that the helmet would have to be removed. As the coat came off his shoulders, he added that he needed to inspect Rosalind's condition personally. As Belinda reached to remove Rosalind's helmet, the restrained noblewoman fought back with whatever strength remained, shouting that she didn't need help, that she refused to accept any treatment from him. Claude paused, unsettled by the sight revealed beneath steel and leather, while Belinda and Wendy drew tight breaths at the ruin shown to their eyes. Ghislain alone reacted without surprise, as if the horrid transformation matched what he had already been assumed. He moved immediately, directing Claude to assist while he retrieved a vial of the medicine he had prepared. He informed Rosalind that the coming week would be agony, but if she could endure the pain, then recovery was possible. Rosalind's response came through gritted teeth. She cursed him, hissed that he must have a death wish. She still didn't believe in him, not even slightly. To her, it was all another sick illusion. But Ghislain was unfazed and her doubt did not bother him. Without pausing, he carefully tilted her head back and forced the first dose of the medicine into her mouth, resolute in his mission to save her, whether she believed in it or not. As Ghislain moved to begin the treatment, desperation laced his voice. He pleaded with a trembling urgency, insisting that if he did not proceed, not only would she die, so would he. The weight of the truth lay bare in his eyes, unshielded and raw, already hollowed by despair. Rosalind felt the helplessness take its final toll. This treatment was being forced upon her. There was no longer any space for resistance, no room for pride. As she listened to Ghislain's voice crack with sincerity, a tear escaped her eye, unbidden, betraying the emotion she had tried so hard to suppress. Ghislain inhaled deeply, steadying himself. With solemn resolve, he summoned his mana. A clear, cerulean ember burst to life around his left hand, glowing like a flame frozen in time. In his heart, he whispered a silent reassurance to her not to be afraid. He would make this work. He had to. He knew all too well the irony of what he was about to do. The method he would use, the one he had staked his life on, had not been created by him. It was a technique invented by none other than Rosalind herself. Compared to the woman he had heard his past life, this Rosalind, though brilliant, lacked the same fierce resilience, the same unyielding willpower. He wasn't certain whether she could withstand what was to come, but certainty had never been a prerequisite for his conviction. So, Ghislain pressed forward, his glowing hand pressed gently against her abdomen, and at once a radiant blue mana spread from the point of contact like ink in water. The warmth of the mana mingled with a subtle heat as it coursed through her body, seeking out the channels shaped by her cultivation and trailing the medicine already within her bloodstream. Rosalind's body jerked. It was as though something inside her had cracked. No, shattered. Then came the pain. It wasn't ordinary. It wasn't even the type of pain that one could steel themselves against. It was excruciating in a way that transcended comprehension, primal, consuming. Every time Ghislain's mana broke through the frozen walls within her mana road, it was as if invisible blades pierced her from the inside. She screamed, violently, uncontrollably, and no forcible could restrain it. Through pain that refused to ebb, Rosalind questioned why the burden had chosen her, why among so many it fastened claws into her life and demanded a week of endurance that seemed designed to break her spirit as well as her body. The thought alone made her heart quake with fury and despair. In the glare of that thought, Ghislain's implacable warning returned to her awareness, the reminder that neglecting treatment would claim his life along with hers, a paired fate that made hesitation feel like complicity. Her shrieks halted, if only for a moment. She gritted her teeth hard enough to draw blood. And in that silent instant, she fixed her gaze on him. red eyes burning through the blur of tears and pain. If death was inevitable, then so be it. But if they were to walk this road together, then he had no right to hold back. She demanded that he give it everything, every breath, every drop of effort, until the very end. Her glare carried the full weight of her soul. Her voice, hoarse yet thunderous, tore through the room as she warned him. If he dared to mess this up, if he faltered even once, she would kill him with her own 2 hands. Her declaration rang in Ghislain's ears with deafening clarity. The screaming resumed immediately after, rawer than before. She cursed him, insulted him, hurled profanity after profanity between each cry of pain. The storm outside roared in tandem, thunder cracking through the sky as if answering her fury. Elsewhere, within the grim stone walls of the eerie castle now, encircled by the kingdom's soldiers, the mercenaries remained oblivious to the trial unfolding behind closed doors. Alpoy paced furiously, heat radiating from his clenched jaw. He was convinced that his foolish master, the so-called northern scoundrel, must have landed them in another impossible mess. Gordon suggested they should go find their captain rather than waiting in anxious silence. Before they could act, footsteps echoed down the staircase. Ghislain and Kaer descended into the main hall, lugging barrels of drink with them. As they reached the ground, Ghislain casually dismissed the idea of searching for Ghislain. Their indifference puzzled the rest of the group. But Kaer simply smirked, encouraging them to relax and drink to their heart's content. Ghislain, he insisted, was not one to act without a plan. And so, the castle settled into uneasy stillness. Dawn of the 7th day broke on Cardea, sunlight parting the thinning cloud and laying bright panes of warmth across slate roofs and wet streets. A gentler counterpoint to nights filled with storm and shouting. Impatience had already won as Marquis Branford mounted the stairs without pause, intent on learning immediately whether the week of ordeal had yielded anything more than exhaustion. The door to Rosalind's room burst open. The Marquis entered, flanked by knights, his expression unreadable. The scent hit first, a suffocating mix of sweat, blood, and stale air. The floor had been soaked red. Rosalind's blood had painted the room like the remnants of a battle. Her bindings had long since been removed. She now lay motionless upon the bed, a white cloth draped over her face. At first glance, one might have thought her lifeless. She had endured it all. The entire week of torment, of fire and agony. The exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. The very thought of Ghislain's voice made her want to tear him apart, but she lacked even the strength to issue a command. Ghislain stood beside her, equally worn down. He had spent 7 days directing his mana with utmost precision, methodically thawing the frozen pathways inside her. Blood stained his form. Her suffering had been internal, brutal, just like his own. Turning his head, he met the Marquis's gaze. The man had entered silently, already standing behind him. One brief look from Marquis Branford conveyed the expectation plainly. A sovereign request for proof that intention had become result, and that this attempt differed from the long chain of failures. Ghislain answered without words as his hand reached for the linen veil resting over Rosalind's face. The motion slow, deliberate, and exact, as if speed itself might bruise what fragile balance had just been reclaimed. The instant Marquis Branford set eyes on his daughter's face, disbelief widened his gaze. After staking life, loyalty, and estate alike, the northern scoundrel known for a single turbulent week had achieved the impossible. Marquis Branford stood still, gazing at Rosalind with a storm of emotion roiling behind his stern expression. After a long, waited moment, he commanded everyone to leave. His daughter needed time. Time to rest, to breathe, and to come to terms with all that had happened. Outside the estate, whispers were already swirling through the streets. The miraculous tale of the Branford family's heir being cured spread like wildfire. Few believed it because too many had tried and failed. Too many had died chasing the same hope. And yet, the news that the Marquis would soon be hosting a grand banquet lent weight to the rumors. Perhaps the impossible had truly occurred. Later that day, after having finally cleaned himself and gathered his thoughts, Ghislain entered the Marquis's office with his aides. It was time to speak of what would come next. The hall quieted as the guests respectfully lowered their heads in a formal bow, acknowledging the success that had unfolded before them. Marquis Branford let out a scoffing breath, his tone layered with reluctant admiration. He remarked that, contrary to his initial judgment, Ghislain had proven himself to be more than mere talk. Though the Marquis had lost the wager, he bore no regret. Witnessing the miraculous recovery of his daughter, after years of failed attempts and endless pain, was a victory far more valuable than any bet. It was, in truth, a profound consolation that transcended pride. With respectful composure, Ghislain responded, stating humbly that it was only possible because the Marquis had dared to take the risk and grant him a chance to act. Wasting no time with pleasantries, Marquis Branford turned the conversation toward the matter at its heart. A promise, he declared, must be honored. With firm resolve, he asked Ghislain to name the reward he desired in return. Attention gathered around Ghislain. Curiosity set faces alight as the hall drew taut with suspense over what demand might rise before a figure as powerful as Branford. Whispered predictions sketched extravagant tributes, alliances, or coin, each theory more elaborate than the last. Ghislain inhaled deeply, raising his head with steady determination. His voice was calm as he declared that his request was not something grand or impossible. At this, the Marquis arched a brow, intrigued, and gave him permission to speak without restraint. In that moment, Ghislain asked Marquis Branford to become his guardian. The weight of the words landed like a thunderclap. Shock painted every face, and Marquis Branford's surprise was especially visible, his eyes widening in disbelief. The air in the room seemed as still as everyone processed what had just been said. Standing nearby, Belinda responded with spontaneous enthusiasm. Her hands shot up in joy as her entire face lit with excitement. Internally, she beamed with pride, thinking to herself that this was exactly like her young lord, to leap boldly into the unknown, unafraid to make outrageous requests that others would never dare voice aloud. Claude, by contrast, shook his head in private calculation, fully recognizing that a guardian would shoulder responsibility for Ghislain's actions regardless of outcome. Power required shelter as well as vision, and a guardian's mantle could grant both while legitimizing ambition. Marquis Branford, recovering from his surprise, gave a measured response. He remarked that Ghislain had initially called this a small favor, but it was now perfectly clear that the young baron had approached him with intention from the very beginning. Ghislain acknowledged the weight of his request as well. He understood fully that what he sought was not simple patronage. To ask for guardianship was to bind Marquis Branford to every consequence of his actions. It was an alliance formed not just in name, but in accountability and risk. Despite the tension, the Marquis gave a slow shake of his head. He stated that he had already placed his hopes on another lord in the north, and therefore could not grant Ghislain's request. His tone was regretful, but resolute. Unshaken, Ghislain asked without hesitation whether the man Branford referred to was Count Brivant. That question struck a nerve. Marquis Branford narrowed his eyes. That name had never been discussed beyond the innermost circle of the royalist faction. For Ghislain to pinpoint it so directly was deeply unsettling. Pressing further, the Marquis listed other notable northern lords, Rayfold and Desmond among them, and asked Ghislain what made him believe that Brivant, specifically, was the intended candidate. Ghislain responded without pause. He revealed his understanding that Desmond merely maintained a facade of neutrality. In truth, no one truly understood where Desmond's allegiance lay. Meanwhile, House Rayfold was embroiled in an internal struggle, leaving their future uncertain and fractured. The remaining lords, Ghislain asserted, were either too weak, too greedy, or too lacking in capability to be considered for such a critical role. However, Count Brivant stood apart. He was undeniably wealthy, closely aligned with the royalist faction, and perhaps most importantly, commanded the formidable magical might of the Scarlet Magic Tower. Based on all these factors, Ghislain had deduced that Brivant's territory was the most likely target for the Marquis's influence. With a sigh, the Marquis asked whether Ghislain was implying that he was more suitable than Brivant. Ghislain met his gaze without flinching and advised the Marquis to be honest with himself. He suggested that Count Brivant was not the dependable ally the Marquis needed. He was lacking, unsatisfyingly so. For a moment, Marquis Branford said nothing. He studied Ghislain intently, his mind reeling at the sheer precision of the young man's insight. Every step Ghislain had taken since arriving in the capital, every calculated risk, every conversation, had been leading to this. Then, unexpectedly, Marquis Branford let out a hearty laugh. He admitted aloud that Ghislain's assumptions were correct. Count Brivant was indeed a kind man, and capable in many respects, but he was also lazy, easily manipulated, and slow to act. Such qualities were fatal flaws in the current political climate. Building upon this, Ghislain remarked that those very flaws had left Brivant vulnerable to influence from the Delphine family, longtime enemies of the Royalist faction. Having laid out the case, Ghislain asked that, if a wish would be granted, boldness should rule the choice. He renewed the request that Marquis Branford recognize him as the effective representative of the northern region, a standard-bearer able to marshal resources and will. Marquis Branford fell into contemplative silence. The boy's ambitions were grand, but not baseless. Ghislain's cosmetic ventures were already gaining traction. Within a few years, he would undoubtedly emerge as a significant figure in the kingdom's economy. Furthermore, with his father, Count Perdium, having recently absorbed Dygald's territory, the Fenris family's influence was poised to grow even further. A little more backing could elevate Ghislain into a powerful cornerstone of the Royalist faction. Everything now made sense. The risk Ghislain had taken wasn't just for Rosalind. It was part of a much broader, calculated move. Finally, Marquis Branford rose to his feet, his voice rising to fill the chamber. With everyone present as witnesses, he declared his decision. He, Marquis Branford, would formally act as guardian to Baron Ghislain Fenris. His voice grew firmer as he proclaimed that any who opposed Ghislain would now be opposing Branford himself. Let it be known, he said, that whoever stood against the Baron would face the full weight of his authority. With that, the Marquis demanded that Ghislain pledge his honor in return. Every future action, every step forward, would carry the responsibility of upholding the Branford name. Without hesitation, Ghislain unsheathed his sword, dropped to one knee, and accepted the condition without ornament or delay. It was a solemn vow, an oath to uphold the dignity of his guardian. The moment was still fresh when Rosalind entered the office, her steps quiet but composed. She offered her congratulations to Ghislain, remarking that, amidst the chaos of recent days, she hadn't yet had the chance to properly greet him. Behind a delicate fan painted in deep blue hues, a mischievous smile lingered on Rosalind's lips as she addressed him. Though her father had already granted him a reward, she claimed with an air of grace that the one who truly owed him a debt of gratitude was none other than herself. With a subtle snap of her wrist, the fan unfurled. Her face, once marred by angry red blotches and chronic affliction, now shone with a flawless, radiant glow. There was no longer any sign of illness. Her features were cold yet dignified, her lips drawn in a firm, composed line. In every detail of her bearing, she now resembled the unshakable authority of her father. Time flowed swiftly, and before long, the grand banquet arrived. The corridors and chambers of the estate buzzed with whispers. Guests murmured, exchanging curious glances as they discussed the astonishing rumor that the once sickly Branford heiress had been cured. Whispered accounts insisted that an obscure noble had accomplished the cure with cosmetics, a tale that wandered from salon to carriage until minds stitched the story to Deneb, the line championed by Countess Muriel, and named it the miracle responsible for Rosalind's recovery. Some, however, argued that no mere cosmetic could mend what physicians and magi together had failed to touch, while others countered that Marquis Branford would never host a banquet without cause. The ledger of his actions traditionally balanced reason with grandeur. As if to add weight to the circulating stories, more speculation followed. The Marquis, it was said, had named a new guardian in the northern region. And just then, as if summoned by the current of rumor itself, Ghislain arrived. Every head turned in unison. Conversations halted mid-sentence as all eyes fixed on Baron Fenris. His presence commanded attention, though he himself looked thoroughly uninterested. By his side walked Belinda, dressed well beyond the expectations for a maid. Traditionally, someone of her station would never be permitted to attend such a prestigious gathering, but Ghislain, indifferent to formalities, had brought her as his companion. Noticing Ghislain's casual demeanor, Belinda leaned in with quiet insistence, scolding him for keeping his hand in his pocket and reminding him to offer a smile. Her voice was firm, as if scolding a wayward child, and though annoyed by the interruption, Ghislain obeyed without protest. Amused, he cast a glance her way and commented on how well she had dressed for the evening. With mild sarcasm, he noted that she might even be overdressed. Belinda smiled, proud but restrained, and admitted that this was likely the only opportunity she would ever have to attend a banquet of such scale. This was no ordinary celebration. It was being held by the kingdom's most influential man on behalf of Ghislain himself. She would not allow herself to be underestimated or looked down upon. Ghislain turned his gaze toward the grand hall, musing inwardly that, truthfully, this event wasn't exactly being held for him, at least not entirely. The soft sound of the announcer's voice echoed through the chamber, heralding the arrival of the evening's host. All movement ceased. A hush fell across the noble gathering as Marquis Branford entered the hall with regal authority. But he did not arrive alone. Walking beside him, poised and dignified, was Rosalind. Her face remained half covered by the fan in her hand, revealing only glimpses of her now restored complexion. This was the first time she had stepped out into the eyes of high society since her long confinement. With every step down the grand staircase, Rosalind radiated composure. Her descent into the hall was met with complete silence. The sound of her shoes against polished marble echoed through the space, underscoring the weight of her presence. Once she reached the center of the gathering, she gracefully unfurled her fan, revealing her full face to the assembly of nobles. The transformation was breathtaking. Rosalind Branford, daughter of Marquis Branford, stood tall and smiled, greeting the assembled guests with polite warmth. She voiced her hope that each of them had been in good health and high spirits. The room erupted in applause and celebratory cheers. The rumors had proven true. She had, indeed, been cured. Among the cries of joy, one voice shouted out that she looked even more beautiful than before her seclusion. Standing nearby, Belinda narrowed her eyes, murmuring under her breath that she had nearly failed to recognize the girl. No one, seeing Rosalind now, would believe that this elegant figure was the same person who had, not long ago, screamed profanities and promised unspeakable pain to her healer. Rosalind had endured every moment of torment without once begging for mercy. She had accused Ghislain of being a fraud, called him a quack, and had even promised to kill him should she survive the pain. Her fury had been unmatched. Now, amidst the hundreds gathered in celebration, Rosalind's gaze sought only one person. Among the noble crowd, it was Ghislain who captured her attention. Her smile, while poised, held an unnerving quality, a subtle, enigmatic curve that unsettled Ghislain more than any curse. Her calm demeanor masked something deeper, and he knew it. Even without the power of her father, Rosalind wielded formidable influence. If resentment lingered in her heart, the consequences could be far-reaching. Ghislain was well aware that he had provoked her harder than most would dare. At last, Marquis Branford raised his voice, addressing the room with commanding clarity. He thanked the assembled nobles for attending, offering his sincere gratitude for their presence. He explained that the purpose of the evening was twofold. First, to celebrate the miraculous recovery of his beloved daughter, Rosalind. Then came the second announcement, one that silenced the room. The Marquis declared that he had officially chosen his ward, a decision that had sparked rumors in the capital and now stood confirmed. He stated, to the astonishment of many, that a single man had made it all possible. It was thanks to this individual, this unassuming young noble, that Rosalind had finally been freed from the chains of her affliction. Some in the room already knew his name. Others did not, but all listened closely. Marquis Branford announced his guardianship over Baron Ghislain Fenris, a young lord who had arrived from the distant and impoverished Blackwater territory in the far north, alone, unknown, and with nothing, and who now stood under the protection of one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. With unwavering authority, the Marquis vowed to fulfill his duty as guardian to the fullest extent. From that moment forward, he declared, all nobles present were to treat Ghislain as they would treat the Marquis himself. Although the Marquis had phrased his declaration as a mere suggestion, every noble present, especially those affiliated with the royalist faction, understood the weight behind his words. It was not a request. It was a command, veiled in civility, that none of them could afford to ignore. Eyes from all corners of the hall shifted toward Ghislain, and a rising tide of hushed murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. To many in attendance, Ghislain was nothing more than the heir to Margrave Perdium, a title inherited from a remote and impoverished northern territory. In their eyes, his background lacked the pedigree or prestige necessary to warrant an alliance with someone of Marquis Branford's standing. Yet Ghislain appeared unfazed. He understood now that Marquis Branford was a man of deliberation, someone who weighed his decisions carefully, but once resolved, committed without hesitation. It was this resolute nature that gave strength to the words spoken that day. His thoughts drifted briefly to a private conversation they had shared. The Marquis had insisted he attend the banquet, reminding Ghislain that, as his guardian, it was his duty to introduce him to the other nobles within the faction. In doing so, Branford hoped to ease future collaborations and open doors to much-needed support. Scanning the hall, Ghislain took note of the many influential figures in attendance. Nearly all the kingdom's prominent nobles were here, and despite the burden of standing before them, he came to recognize the value of the event. This evening could, indeed, serve as a vital stepping stone. Still, the murmurs persisted. Voices questioned his youth, speculated on his worthiness, and expressed doubt over the Marquis's seemingly sudden endorsement. Perdium, after all, was a territory known more for its poverty than power. Belinda, standing nearby, clenched her fists inwardly. She could feel her anger stir at the arrogance of these nobles, their ignorance grating like sandpaper. But before she could act or speak, Rosalind took a step forward. Ever perceptive, Rosalind had already formulated a response. She descended the steps and approached Ghislain, each movement measured with poise. In front of the entire hall, she curtsied before him with flawless form, her gaze never leaving his. With that single gesture, she made a statement more powerful than any speech. Her father may have declared himself Ghislain's guardian, but Rosalind's public gratitude was a personal acknowledgement, one that resonated deeply among the watching nobles. It was clear that the Branford family, as a whole, stood united in their support. In the privacy of their brief exchange, Rosalind subtly advised Ghislain to ignore the background noise. Petty rumors, she noted, were inevitable for anyone who drew attention. The louder the voices, the more relevant the subject. She reminded him that today was significant, not just because it marked her return to public life, but also because her father's allegiance had been made known. The nobles would be restless now, uncertain how to react to the unexpected alignment. Their curiosity would soon give way to action. Extending her hand, she invited Ghislain to accompany her in greeting the key figures of the royalist circle. It was both a courtesy and a challenge, and every pair of eyes followed the motion. Some in the crowd remained skeptical, clinging to old prejudices against the northern lord. Others, however, found themselves captivated by Rosalind's beauty and poise, now elevated by the mystery surrounding her recovery. As for Ghislain, he recognized Rosalind as a complex force, difficult to predict, but essential to understand. To Rosalind, he appeared equally intriguing, someone whose boldness might serve him well if tempered wisely. Ghislain glanced back, seeking Belinda's approval. She simply smiled and waved him on, a quiet affirmation that she would remain in the background, allowing him to face the highborn elite on his own. Taking Rosalind's hand, Ghislain allowed himself to be led through the crowd. She explained, with cool precision, the internal structure of the royalist faction. The faction, she said, could broadly be divided into three dominant groups. The first was led by Countess Muriel, matriarch of the affluent house of Aylesbury. Her family held sway over the capital's economy and culture, commanding immense influence within the city's markets and salons. The second group was overseen by the Chief Justice of the realm, Sir Bylor Norton, Rosalind's own uncle and the eldest son of the Royal Chancellor. He controlled the kingdom's legal and administrative affairs with a meticulous hand. The third and final pillar of power was Marquis Maurice Macquarie, the commander-in-chief of the kingdom's military forces. His domain included most of the army's senior officers, and his voice carried authority across all matters concerning national defense. Together, these three figures represented the administrative, economic, and military backbone of the Lithania kingdom. Rosalind warned that, as the newly declared representative of the northern region, Ghislain's choice of whom to greet first would carry symbolic weight. It would shape perceptions elevate egos or bruise pride. A sharp wave of anxiety struck him as her words echoed the earlier warning from Marquis Branford. The world he now stepped into was foreign, ruthless in its own way, and dictated by invisible rules. Though Branford's support was reassuring, it also placed a crushing burden on his shoulders. A single misstep tonight could sow discord with powerful allies. Ghislain let out a long, resigned sigh. No matter whom he approached first, offense would surely be taken by the others. His thoughts returned to Count Aylesbury and his wife. He had already become somewhat familiar with them, and he knew that their factions' influence over commerce aligned well with his own ventures. Across the room, he noticed Count Bylor Norton smiling at him with warmth. The man had a reputation for adoring his niece, and Ghislain suspected that curing Rosalind had earned him no small measure of favor. Yet it was Marquis Macquarie who posed the greatest challenge. Known for his pride and temper, he was not someone to take lightly. Wanting to rip the bandage off quickly, Ghislain made his decision. He stepped forward and approached Count Aylesbury, offering a formal greeting and introducing himself with proper decorum. From across the room, Marquis Macquarie stiffened. The gesture had not gone unnoticed. His pride took a hit, evident in the flicker of annoyance in his expression. To be overlooked so openly would surely sting. But Count Aylesbury welcomed Ghislain with a kind smile, clearly pleased. While often viewed as the least threatening among the faction leaders, receiving the first greeting from Branford's ward had elevated his status in the eyes of many. Countess Mary fanned herself and let out a melodious chuckle. With theatrical flair, she affectionately called Ghislain her little brother, praising his loyalty with exaggerated admiration. Ghislain responded with a gentle reminder that formal occasions called for more appropriate conduct, but she waved him off, insisting such rules need not apply when the bonds were so warm. She even thanked him openly, acknowledging that this public gesture had helped salvage her standing among the nobility. Marquis Macquarie cleared his throat with deliberate volume to ensure Ghislain heard, staking a claim to attention befitting the man who controlled the kingdom's military and resented any hint of slight. An aide amplified the signal by declaring that a Margrave's son ought naturally to pay respects to the commander first, while another aide, less cautious, implied that Marquis Branford's judgment had dulled with age to mistake the order of precedence. Ghislain, of course, recognized the game being played. The criticism was thinly veiled, and Macquarie's expectation of deference was clear. The military lord was not a man who tolerated disrespect. As Ghislain began moving in the direction of the nobles, all present assumed that he would do the expected, that he would approach Macquarie next and pay the appropriate homage. After all, even arrogance had its limits. But those expectations were swiftly shattered. Without breaking stride, Ghislain walked directly past the Marquis, offering no bow, no nod, not even a glance. The Marquis's face darkened in fury, his jaw tightening as Ghislain headed straight toward Count Bylor Norton. There, Ghislain greeted the Chief Justice with composed civility. He thanked him for his kind words and acknowledged the burden that had been lifted from the man's heart with Rosalind's recovery. Count Norton, warm and affable, was not offended to be greeted second. In fact, he seemed relieved. He even went so far as to extend an offer of practical support, assistance in acquiring skilled dwarven and elven slaves to help develop Ghislain's territory. Only after finishing his exchange with Count Norton did Ghislain, finally, turn to approach Marquis Macquarie. But by then, the slight had been fully delivered, and the damage was done. Marquis Macquarie's rage boiled visibly beneath the surface. His tone was scathing as he warned Ghislain not to become conceited simply because Marquis Branford had taken him under his wing. He reminded the young baron that distant lords, no matter how favored, could be cut off with a single command. In response, Ghislain remained composed. With grace, he acknowledged his own shortcomings and humbly requested the Marquis's continued guidance in the future. Across the room, Marquis Branford watched with a private curl of amusement as Macquarie's temper flared, mentally reducing the quarrel to the rough abrasions of a countryside brat, and then smoothing the moment with invented reasons why the greeting might have come last. Once the formalities with the kingdom's power players had ended, Rosalind approached Ghislain again. She asked whether the order in which he had greeted them had been intentional. Ghislain, feeling a flicker of nervousness, simply replied that he had allowed his heart to guide him in the moment. The exchange ended as nobles, encouraged by the evening's thaw, converged upon the pair. One after another approached Ghislain with polished compliments and, in some cases, carefully chosen gifts meant to signal early allegiance. Meanwhile, Count Aylesbury, his wife, and Count Norton observed the spectacle from a quiet corner of the hall. Despite the outward smiles and compliments directed toward Ghislain, the trio knew better. Beneath the noble civility, there lingered a subtle layer of disdain. Count Aylesbury chuckled softly, commenting on how thoroughly Ghislain had managed to earn Marquis Macquarie's resentment. Countess Muriel dismissed the concern. Macquarie, she said, was a simple man. Count Norton, more pragmatic, observed that despite the general's displeasure, Macquarie could not afford to act against Ghislain. It was at that moment that Marquis Branford joined their conversation. He stated with calm confidence that of course Macquarie couldn't move against Ghislain. After all, it had been Ghislain, and Ghislain alone, who had achieved what no one else could, curing Rosalind's illness. Count Norton offered a compliment, praising the Marquis for discovering such an extraordinary talent. But Branford deflected the praise. He admitted that, while many had failed to recognize Ghislain's worth, he had merely chosen to believe. The success, he insisted, belonged entirely to Ghislain himself. It was Ghislain's own tenacity and strength that had raised him from obscurity to stand in the presence of the kingdom's elite. The Marquis went on, elaborating that Ghislain possessed the rare ability to transform a losing battle into victory. He had a mind not only for warfare, but for strategy, able to observe the flow of events and predict what lay beyond the horizon. In Branford's estimation, Ghislain was worthy of the North and deserving of his backing. Still, he added, such a sudden rise came with risk. The brighter the light, the deeper the shadow it cast. And with so much attention now focused on Ghislain, those shadows would only grow. It was then that the hall fell eerily silent. At the entrance, the voice of an attendant rang out, trembling with uncertainty as it announced a name, Viscount Joseph. The name echoed like a cold wind through the hall. Conversations halted midward, and glasses were lowered without a sound. Ghislain's entire expression changed in an instant, hardening into a mask of composure. Guests forced smiles onto their faces as they turned toward the grand doors. Every noble knew the name, Viscount Raoul Joseph, often called the Crippled Devil. Known for his ruthless intellect and merciless tactics, he was one of the most feared men in the political sphere. The man now entered the hall with a deliberate gait, leaning on a cane due to his badly deformed leg. Yet there was nothing feeble about him. His aura was like iron, unyielding, forceful, commanding. Every step he took seemed to sap the warmth from the room. Ghislain's fists clenched at his sides. His jaw tightened as he forced down the murderous intent rising within him. This was the enemy, the one who had once stood in the way of everything. He was also the closest advisor to Duke Delphine, the royalist faction's greatest adversary, and a strategist behind many of the ducal family's most cunning moves. His unexpected presence at a royalist banquet sent a shiver through the room. To Ghislain, this was more than just a surprise. Though this marked their first encounter in this timeline, he knew the man all too well from his previous life. Viscount Joseph had played a critical role in undermining his plans during the failed campaign to burn the Delphine estate to the ground. He had been the one to outmaneuver Ghislain's mercenaries and deliver a crushing blow to his ambitions. And following behind him was another figure, a tall, well-built man whose chest bore the distinct emblem of a silver star. His face remained entirely concealed beneath a mask, and his figure shrouded in an oversized robe that obscured every detail of his physique, and even his hair. Standing silently behind Viscount Raoul Joseph, the man presented himself as nothing more than a dutiful escort. However, those who knew the truth would have recognized him as none other than Count Balzac, the kingdom's finest sword, a sword master hiding in plain sight under the guise of personal guard. The moment Raoul arrived, a murmur spread like ripples through the banquet hall. Whispers filled the space as apprehension crept into the atmosphere. The arrival of someone from the ducal house was rarely seen as anything but ominous. One guest quietly expressed regret at attending, convinced that nothing good could come from entanglement with the Delphine faction. Without hesitation, Viscount Joseph strode directly toward Marquis Branford. Upon reaching him, Raoul offered a courteous yet measured greeting, acknowledging that considerable time had passed since their last meeting. The Marquis, as host, returned the pleasantry, though the stiffness in his posture betrayed his displeasure. He noted aloud that Raoul had never before shown any interest in such events, making his attendance all the more curious. Raoul offered a faint nod and explained his presence. He had come, he said, to lay eyes upon the young lion that the Marquis had chosen to support. There had been much talk about this Baron Fenris, a man who had not only developed a cosmetic product that swept the capital, but had also captured the attention of powerful factions. Marquis Branford's brow furrowed, and he clicked his tongue as if to brush away a foul taste. His response came sharp and deliberate, declaring that he hoped Raoul's interest would go no further than mere curiosity. As his eyes shifted behind Raoul, he voiced his irritation more openly, demanding to know the identity of the masked individual accompanying him, an unusual sight in such a formal setting. Raoul remained composed, stating that the masked man was merely his escort knight, and hardly someone worth the Marquis's concern. At that moment, Knight Commander Tolio stepped forward. His tone was stern and uncompromising as he insisted the masked man should remove his concealment and reveal his identity, especially in the presence of so many high-ranking nobles. But the figure in question remained still, like a statue unmoved by the demand. No flinch, no voice, no acknowledgement. Tolio, perceiving the silence as insolence, instinctively reached for the hilt of his sword. His command grew sharper, insisting once more that the masked man obey. The tension in the hall thickened as all eyes watched the standoff unfold. Before the matter could escalate further, Marquis Branford intervened, raising a hand to halt Tolio's movement. His voice was firm yet measured, reminding everyone present that Raoul would not have brought someone with malicious intent to the banquet, no matter their affiliation. The statement was a clear line drawn in the sand. Raoul was permitted to remain, but he was not welcome. Raoul offered a cool expression of thanks in response, as if unaffected by the subtle rebuke. Once the formalities ended, the Marquis turned inward with concern. There had been no reports, no indication from his intelligence network that Raoul had even entered the capital. The realization settled heavily. Duke Delphine's influence had reached deeper into the city than previously thought. Meanwhile, Raoul began walking toward Ghislain. The act was casual, but the tension that followed was not. Ghislain had to summon every shred of discipline to restrain the murderous intent stirring within him, especially under the gaze of Count Balzac, a man whose skill could detect even the slightest ripple of aggression. The young ladies who had surrounded Ghislain only moments before had vanished, their presence scattered like birds sensing danger in the air. Raoul approached without rush, his demeanor smooth and condescending, as though addressing a child at play rather than the man of the hour. As their eyes met, Ghislain reached a grim certainty. The Duke's web had indeed spread this far. For Raoul to stand there, unannounced, amidst a banquet hosted by the royalist faction, proved just how little resistance Delphine's spies encountered. Raoul studied Ghislain's expression with mild amusement, and wondered aloud if perhaps the young baron had heard of him before. Ghislain responded with an indifferent nod, noting that tales of the Viscount's exploits were hard to avoid in the capital. The remark seemed to amuse Raoul, who then added that he too had heard about Ghislain, the infamous Baron Fenris, known for stirring up activity in the north. There is a smug undertone in Raoul's voice as he alluded to Ghislain's actions, as if reminding him that every move he made had been observed. Ghislain, aware of the charade, saw through Raoul's feigned innocence. Every underhanded scheme that had weakened Perdium, every attempt to isolate it, destabilize the Scarlet Flame magic tower, and support Amelia's rebellion, bore Raoul's touch. Yet Raoul had the audacity to pretend ignorance, acting as if this meeting were one between curious strangers. Despite the fury boiling inside him, Ghislain knew he could not act. Not here, not now. Still, he could not help but imagine the many ways Raoul might die at his hands. Raoul then suggested they find somewhere more private to continue the conversation, claiming he had something important to discuss. Ghislain did not respond with words, but his silent agreement moved them both to a quiet, prepared chamber within the estate. A tea table had already been set, as if the meeting had been expected all along. Raoul leaned back comfortably as the door shut behind them. He remembered past strategies, the ones meant to isolate Perdium, undermine Dygald, and push the rebellion forward. All of it had seemed to work until Ghislain returned and upended those plans. Not only had Perdium survived, but Ghislain had released a cosmetic product that swept the market, throwing Raoul's own development efforts into disarray. The Viscount wasted no time. He admitted his interest in Ghislain's product, the one rumored to have restored Rosalind's skin and changed the tide of public opinion. Ghislain shut down the proposition with cold efficiency. He made it clear that no cooperation, no discussion, and no courtesy would be extended. Raoul took the rejection in stride, brushing it off as though it had been expected. With a dismissive gesture, he shifted topics, claiming that such mundane matters did not interest him after all. Instead, he leaned forward, eyes gleaming with manipulation, and spoke of wasted potential. A man with Ghislain's talents, he said, should not waste away in some forgotten corner of the north, toiling for nothing. Raoul continued, his voice calm yet sharp, as he reflected on the irony of a once notorious troublemaker suddenly gaining prominence, winning wars, and securing a position of importance in the capital. He questioned aloud whether such developments could truly be chalked up to coincidence, or if it was a testament to genuine skill. Ghislain responded without flair, his demeanor as indifferent as his words. He simply stated that he had studied, offering no elaboration beyond that. Beneath the placid surface, however, raged a fire he could barely contain. Every breath he took felt like a battle against the instinct to act, for his very soul cried out for vengeance. Raising the Delphine faction to the ground had become his life's sole purpose. And Raoul, the architect behind so many of the schemes, sat within arm's reach. But Ghislain knew better. The moment he acted on his killing intent, the swordmaster standing beside Raoul would intervene. Raoul, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing across from him, shifted gears. He acknowledged that his meticulous plan to dominate the north had been flawless, until the arrival of one disruptive element, Ghislain. Without missing a beat, Raoul extended an invitation for a place within Duke Delphine's powerful faction. No response came from Ghislain. Instead, he calculated, eyes scanning for a single exploitable flaw, a fleeting opportunity to slip past the finest sword in the kingdom and deliver one decisive blow. But no such moment came. Still unaware of the death that loomed just across the table, Raoul continued. He spoke of how talent, no matter how brilliant, came with an expiration date. In a brutal frontier like the North, life was cheap, and danger lurked in every shadow. He warned that Ghislain's journey could be cut short by barbarians or war long before his potential had been fulfilled. Many promising young lives, Raoul explained, had already been snuffed out before their prime. And so, he urged Ghislain to entrust his future to the Duke's house. In doing so, Raoul promised all such threats would vanish, and Ghislain's path would be paved in security. Balzac, standing silently at Raoul's back, had already sensed the waves of killing intent leaking from Ghislain like a poisonous mist. He did not draw his weapon. He didn't need to. Should Ghislain make a move, he would be cut down before taking a single breath. And worse still, any attack on a guest at such a gathering would bring heavy consequences. It was then that Ghislain finally responded, his tone respectful yet firm. He stated that he had already pledged his allegiance to the royalist faction. Raoul countered that a shallow pledge did not equate to true loyalty. Dipping one's toes in water did not mean they had plunged in. To sweeten his offer, Raoul mentioned a luxurious estate in the south, ready and waiting for Ghislain and his father, Zwalter. He pressed on, stating how Count Perdium, Ghislain's father, struggled constantly to defend the north from barbarian incursions. Raoul questioned how long they could keep fighting and suggested that perhaps it was time Ghislain considered living in comfort rather than in conflict. It was a familiar tactic, temptation disguised as generosity. Ghislain recognized it immediately. This was how the Delphine faction operated, offering sanctuary and resources while quietly binding others to their will. They believed they could purchase his allegiance and tame his unpredictability. Ghislain, unfazed by the flattery and underlying manipulation, voiced his disagreement. He noted aloud that the north was far from the desolate wasteland Raoul had painted it to be. Raoul offered a knowing smile. He admitted he hadn't expected an immediate answer. He simply wanted Ghislain to consider the offer carefully during his extended stay in the capital. That smile faltered, however, when Ghislain leaned forward and presented a counter-proposal. In an almost mocking tone laced with false innocence, Ghislain suggested that perhaps Raoul should consider joining the royalist faction instead. The audacity of the suggestion stunned Raoul. For a moment, his composed expression cracked as he wondered whether this young lord was dangerously naive or simply fearless to a fault. Eventually, he concluded that Ghislain was simply foolish for refusing a path that could have saved his life. With no further words exchanged, Raoul prepared to return south, his offer rejected. Internally, he scoffed at what he perceived to be a wasted talent. Ghislain, in his eyes, was a gifted individual who had chosen the wrong path. Raoul had seen it countless times, those with great potential extinguishing their own light through poor choices. He believed that, in the end, people like that had no one to blame but themselves. Later, once they were alone, Balzac finally broke his silence. He asked Raoul for his evaluation after seeing Ghislain in person. Raoul, crippled and devoid of martial prowess, nonetheless had a keen strategist's mind. He considered his words carefully before remarking that Ghislain's eyes were unsettling, peculiar to the point that they evoked a primal urge in him to gouge them out. There was something deeply untrustworthy in their gleam. As he considered Ghislain's posture and expression, Raoul described him as energetic and seemingly without fear. He interpreted that fearlessness as arrogance, a dangerous trait in a young noble. He noted the hostility Ghislain barely contained and considered a flaw. But Balzac, ever more perceptive, disagreed. He explained that Ghislain had, in fact, attempted to kill him. Raoul, startled, asked for clarity. Balzac couldn't say for certain, but he had sensed traces of killing intent at various points. It was faint, carefully restrained, but unmistakably present. They both shared a moment of disbelief. Could Ghislain truly have intended to murder a viscount at a public banquet, surrounded by the eyes and ears of the capital? It seemed implausible, and yet the sensation had been real. Balzac elaborated, explaining that throughout their encounter, Ghislain had subtly continued to evaluate him. Every movement, every shift in stance had the precision of someone calculating odds. It was more than just wariness, it was assessment. As a transcendence, Balzac's instincts told him that Ghislain had been measuring whether he could bypass the kingdom's finest swordmaster to strike down Raoul. The idea was staggering. For someone so young to entertain such a notion, even briefly, and to do so while keeping up appearances, that alone confirmed how real the rumors surrounding Ghislain might be. Here stood a young noble, unshaken in the presence of overwhelming power, unafraid to stare down a transcendence. In that moment, their gazes locked. Ghislain and Balzac understood one another, each recognizing the other as a sworn enemy. It was a meeting of equals, of warriors who spoke without words. For Balzac, this meeting cemented a truth. Ghislain was entirely serious in his devotion to the royalist cause. He had not allied with them out of convenience, but out of principle. Had Ghislain actually made his move, Balzac knew he would have stopped him. No matter how skilled the young lord was, his path to Raoul would have been blocked. For a brief instant, the air between them shimmered with tension. It was as if both had silently crossed blades. Though no steel was drawn, the conclusion was clear. Balzac would parry every attack Ghislain dared to launch. For now, however, the swords remained sheathed. Even though Ghislain stood ready to commit everything he had, the towering wall before him remained immovable. The kingdom's finest swordmaster, unwavering and absolute, would not yield. As a transcendence, a being whose power eclipsed ordinary humans, Balzac possessed a vast reservoir of mana, easily dwarfing Ghislain's own. The difference was not only in power but in depth, control, and experience. Ultimately, Ghislain refrained from making a move. The wall he needed to scale was far too high, and he knew it. The storm in his heart subsided beneath the weight of grim pragmatism, and the conversation ended without bloodshed. Yet, even as he kept his blade sheathed, his teeth clenched in frustration. Raoul, momentarily taken aback by the suggestion, couldn't help but admire the young man before him. In the end, he conceded a silent defeat in that moment of exchange, musing that Marquis Branford had indeed found someone extraordinary in Ghislain. With the meeting concluded, Raoul made his way toward the exit, leaving behind only parting words. If opportunity allowed, he said, he would welcome another encounter. Ghislain responded in kind, keeping his composure while stating that he too would look forward to such a day. As Raoul departed, Balzac's eyes remained fixed on Ghislain. He waited, silent and still, until Raoul was completely out of reach. His instincts told him Ghislain had seriously contemplated launching an attack, and even now, Balzac suspected the young noble's thoughts ran along that path. In that heavy pause, Ghislain broke the silence. He formally extended his greetings, his tone composed, and revealed that he had seen through the masked identity. The man standing as Raoul's personal guard could only have been the famed swordmaster, Balzac. Inside the carriage on their return, Balzac acknowledged Ghislain's perceptiveness. He noted that, even in disguise, Ghislain had recognized him. Hearing this, Raoul found himself unable to dismiss the rumors surrounding the young baron. Perhaps there was more truth to the stories than he had first assumed. Still, Raoul insisted that a delayed plan to conquer the north was not a failure. Many options remained, and there was time yet. Even so, he advised that Desmond be warned. In dealing with Ghislain, Desmond should consider him a knight commander-level threat and make preparations accordingly. But Balzac shook his head at such a conservative estimation. In his view, Ghislain was not just a knightly threat. He might well be the strongest swordsman in the north. Raoul lacked the martial instinct to make such a judgment, but Balzac had seen what others missed. Ghislain's every motion, every breath, carried purpose. He had even left subtle openings in his stance, ones that Balzac noticed, but they felt intentional, as if designed to test an opponent's reactions. That realization solidified Balzac's belief. Ghislain was more than formidable. He was terrifying, a warrior born for greatness. Ghislain's castle retained its air of gloom, a quiet shadow over the bustling trade that pulsed through its gates. Despite the surge in wealth, it wasn't enough for what he had in mind, and he couldn't afford to sell more runestones since he had used for them. Within the walls, Kaer and Claude were immersed in their duties, meticulously documenting each trade transaction, every crate of goods coming in and out. The influx of wealth had become overwhelming, chests overflowing with glittering gold coins. Beyond the castle grounds, Ghislain supervised the logistics of distributing essential supplies to Perdium and Fenris. These provisions were courtesy of Marquis Branford, who had formally assumed the role of Ghislain's guardian. As Ghislain's return drew near, Rosalind found herself dreading the moment. Though she said little, her expression betrayed disappointment when he casually spoke of his upcoming departure. They had worked closely, side by side, building Deneb's foundation through its supply chain and growing sales network. That partnership, brief as it was, had become something she genuinely valued. While Rosalind seemed quietly hopeful for more time together, Ghislain remained emotionally distant. His demeanor made it clear he sought no companionship from the enigmatic young woman. Without acknowledging her subtle signals, Ghislain shifted the conversation toward their financial agreement. He reminded her of their contract, the promise she made to pay 300,000 gold for Deneb's capital, and his role in managing that distribution. As he outlined the arrangement, Rosalind's enthusiasm drained from her features. The joy and liveliness in her expression vanished the moment he steered the discussion back to gold and business. For someone so cunning, Ghislain remained utterly oblivious to emotional cues. Feeling brushed aside, Rosalind responded with quiet frustration. She questioned whether there was truly nothing else he ever wished to talk about with her, nothing beyond financial terms and responsibilities. Ghislain deflected, insisted their relationship was one of guardian and beneficiary, nothing more, and certainly nothing that demanded deeper conversation. She exhaled, her breath heavy with resignation, and gently countered. In order to fulfill her role properly, she argued, she needed to understand him more fully. She pressed further, asking about his true goals, what truly drove him to dedicate himself so obsessively to his work. Her request was valid, but his mind remained fixed on returning home as quickly as possible. He had vowed to reshape his mercenaries into knights, capable of wielding mana. He had begun preparations for war against Desmond. Plans had been laid for the settlement of freed slaves within Fenris. And looming over it all was the specter of a kingdom-wide catastrophe that only he anticipated. With a composed smile, he offered her a false answer. He claimed that he simply wanted to live well and eat well. Of the future he foresaw, he said nothing. That truth, those burdens, were his alone to carry. Even if she believed his response, that belief changed nothing about the weight he bore. Yet Rosalind's intuition told her otherwise, and his words rang hollow. If comfort and peace were truly his goals, she reasoned, then aligning with Duke Delphine's faction, as Count Joseph had suggested, would have been the wiser course. Instead, he had committed himself to the royalist faction, an action that contradicted the story he told. The moment she mentioned Raoul's name, his entire expression shifted. The warmth vanished from his features, replaced by an unreadable coldness. Only Ghislain truly understood the depth of Raoul's capabilities, and it left a bitter taste in his mouth that he had failed to strike him down during their last encounter. In Ghislain's original offer to the Branford family, he proposed 10% of Deneb's profits in return for an investment of 300,000 gold, with the added task of handling product distribution. Marquis Branford had dismissed the proposal outright, until Rosalind offered to lead the operation herself. To most, it seemed like a one-sided deal. Only Rosalind had the conviction to see potential in it. Ghislain, though unable to explain what he anticipated for the future, made one thing clear. As the heir of Perdium and the Lord of Fenris, he had committed himself to a singular, unwavering goal, one only he could see clearly in the shifting fog of what lay ahead. He explained that her strength would be essential to his plans, though he wished not to weigh her down with the burden. A war against Duke Delphine was inevitable, and if she remained focused solely on the business side of operations, then at the very least, she would be spared the dangers of conflict and remain safe. Yet Rosalind did not accept such a rationale without protest. She insisted that they were meant to share their burdens equally, especially since Ghislain operated under the protection and patronage of her family. To her, partnership required more than division. It required mutual trust. It was in that moment of heated discussion that Ghislain's hand suddenly reached for hers. The swiftness of his motion startled her, causing her fan to slip from her grasp and fall. Though it seemed for an instant that he might have swatted her hand away, his touch was unexpectedly gentle. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss upon its back, a solemn gesture to convey his request, that she place her absolute trust in him. He had not come to the capital merely to linger in idle conversation, but to earn the endorsement of the royalist faction while many still awaited him. His sudden and intimate act left Rosalind speechless. Her cheeks grew warm as the blood rushed to her face, caught off guard by the intensity of what he had done. Ghislain had charged into her world without warning, disrupting everything, yet planting a lasting presence in her heart that she could not easily cast aside. The moment that passed between them was tinged with quiet sorrow. Ghislain had no desire to endanger her life, and for that reason alone, he forced himself to walk away, knowing that the confusion and ache he left behind would linger in her thoughts. She stood motionless, watching as the man who had led her through hell and back walked away. As he parted, his final words carried a heavy sincerity. All he wanted for her was happiness. Only he understood the weight of those words, shaped by the memories of a life she had lived once before, though she had no knowledge of it. Rosalind could not fully grasp what he meant. Left alone in silence, her mind wandered to thoughts of Fenris. She pondered whether the territory was truly as remarkable as he claimed, and what kind of Lord Ghislain would prove to be over such a place. With his business in the capital complete, Ghislain's attention turned sharply toward the future. His first objective was to transform Fenris into a stronghold, capable of standing its ground against the forces of powerful nobles like Desmond and Amelia in the north. The banquet he attended concluded on a high note, a quiet triumph. Ghislain secured a formal position under the ministry of the royal palace, attaining the prestigious title of Northern Administrator. This marked a significant step forward in his campaign for recognition and influence. By rejecting the offer from Raoul, he had not only protected his own ambition, but had also upheld the dignity of Marquis Branford. This earned him the nobleman's trust and gratitude, both valuable assets in the volatile arena of court politics. The supplies that had once been destined for Brabant territory were now rerouted to Perdium and Fenris. With the authority and name of Branford behind them, both territories received exemptions and privileges, tax relief, trading rights, and legal protections that strengthened their standing. Moreover, Ghislain secured the relocation of 50,000 royal subjects to Fenris, bolstering its population and workforce. Among them were skilled dwarf slaves, individuals whose craftsmanship and labor would contribute significantly to Fenris's development. These changes signaled to the rest of the kingdom that Perdium and Fenris could no longer be dismissed as weak or impoverished borderlands. However, Ghislain could not overlook the greater implications. The fact that both Raoul and Balzac had approached him in person spoke volumes. They were not acting on a whim. There were machinations at work, plans forming in the shadows, and Ghislain knew he had little time left to remain idle. This realization pressed heavily upon him. He could not afford even a moment of hesitation, not when the stakes were this high. A single misstep could lead to the loss of everything he had rebuilt, and he refused to let history repeat itself. Within him, the fire of vengeance burned steadily, feeding on old scars and promises left unfulfilled. He had made a vow to wipe Duke Delphine and all that bore his name from existence. The last time Ghislain had assaulted the Duke's estate, he had slipped past the Mercenary King only to fall to Idun. That failure would not be repeated. This time, he would finish what he started. Back in the lands of Fenris, the territory awaited. The estate lay bathed in peace, its fields glowing golden with ripened grain, ready for the harvest. It was a tranquil sight, a brief moment of calm before the storm that Ghislain knew was coming. The dwarven slaves arrived at the estate before Ghislain. Renowned for their tireless work ethic, the dwarves had long been known as the most industrious of all races. However, their years in bondage had stripped them of dignity and purpose, relegating them to crafting trinkets and baubles for vain nobles. The result was an ever-growing hatred, deep-seated resentment that festered with each passing day, aimed at every noble who crossed their path. Among those recently purchased by Ghislain was a figure of considerable skill and reputation, Galberic, the most accomplished blacksmith of their kind. Ghislain had specifically arranged for his acquisition, fully aware that in time, Galberic would stand among legends and join the ranks of those who would battle humanity's most formidable enemy. As the newly arrived dwarves were gathered for registration and processing, one of their number called out to Galberic with nonchalance, informing him that the lord of the estate had returned to the territory. Word of Ghislain's arrival spread with the speed of wildfire. The people of Fenris poured into the streets in great numbers, their voices raised in exuberant cheers. Their excitement was palpable, a celebration not just of his safe return, but of the bounty he had once again brought with him. Wealth and resources that would be invested into the very land they all toiled to nurture. Claude rode among them, pride swelling in his chest. He had played a direct role in securing the latest haul, and now, surrounded by celebration, he felt that pride justified. Beside him, Belinda could barely contain her joy, overwhelmed by a reception that no other estate could ever hope to match. Kaer and Gillian rode confidently atop their steeds, sharing in the collective triumph. Unlike the fearful displays common in other lands, the people of Perdium and Fenris did not grovel before their lord. They met him with open admiration, not fear, for he had earned their loyalty not through tyranny, but trust. These were people who had spent sleepless nights worrying about their lord's fate, imagining the worst, his failure, his capture, the return of cruel oppressors. His safe return banished those fears and brought an emotional release that echoed through the air. The dwarves, however, observed all of this with skepticism. Never before had they witnessed a territory that welcomed a noble with such honest joy. Rumors they had heard on the road claimed this lord built homes for his people, ensured that no one went hungry, and treated his citizens with fairness. It all sounded too good to be true. Galberic, for one, was not swayed. Watching the celebration unfold, he sighed heavily, dismissing the entire scene as an elaborate facade. He turned to the others, reminding them not to let their guard down. A noble, in his eyes, would always remain a noble, self-serving, manipulative, and ultimately driven by greed. Bitterness clung to his voice. The years had not softened his opinion. In his mind, nobles were irredeemable parasites who cloaked their ambitions in empty generosity. Another dwarf called Galberic's name in frustration, exasperated by his inability to let go of hatred. A third asked, more cautiously, whether he still intended to move forward with their escape plan. Galberic's expression hardened. His eyes remained fixed on Ghislain as he gave his answer, calm and firm that they would proceed as planned. Unbeknownst to the others, Ghislain had already discerned their intentions. His gaze settled briefly on Galberic, recognizing in him an old companion from a different time, one not yet reacquainted in this life. Though memories tugged at his heart, he knew trust would have to be earned anew. Belinda noticed the distant look on Ghislain's face and rode closer, nudging him gently to snap him from his thoughts. She suggested he acknowledge the crowd, pointing out the eager faces gathered to welcome him home. After her reminder, Ghislain lifted his hand and offered a wave to his people, though his gesture lacked enthusiasm. Still basking in the energy of the moment, Claude declared how wonderful it felt to return. With wealth now flowing into the estate, he believed a period of rest finally awaited him. His hopes were dashed almost immediately, because without missing a beat, Ghislain instructed him to organize the research materials Lowell had prepared and deliver them to the office. Claude groaned, protesting that they had just returned and deserved time to recover. But Ghislain remained unwavering. There was no rest for an official still bound by a slave contract. He told Claude to treat his time in the capital as a vacation, because the real work resumed now. Without further delay, Ghislain summoned all of his aides. The time for reunion had passed. The meeting would begin at once. Ghislain initiated the meeting with a question directed at Lowell, inquiring whether there had been any issues involving Chief Homern during his absence in the capital. Since the death of the previous lord, Lowell had proven himself a trustworthy retainer under Ghislain's leadership, and he reported without hesitation that no disturbances had taken place. In response, Ghislain instructed him to notify Chief Homern of an impending visit to Perdium. He also requested a detailed briefing on the current state of affairs during the time he had been away. Lowell explained that everything had proceeded exactly as Ghislain had ordered prior to his departure. The territory had been maintained effectively, and operations continued smoothly in accordance with the original plans. As the report continued, Alpoy made a passing comment, noting that he had observed completed roadworks and newly constructed waterways on the journey back to the estate. He seemed almost impressed, remarking casually on the progress made during his and Vanessa's absence. Vanessa quickly interjected, lightly reprimanding Alpoy to show proper respect to the Lord when speaking. Lowell resumed his report, elaborating further. In addition to the roads and waterways, several vital facilities, such as the workshops and grain storage warehouses, were nearing completion. With the recent influx of skilled dwarven laborers brought from the capital, Lowell estimated that the remaining construction would finish quickly. Of particular note was the agricultural output, which had been so abundant that purchasing grain from outside merchants would no longer be necessary. The unexpected news sparked Belinda's curiosity, prompting her to ask for exact figures regarding the harvest. She leaned forward with interest, unable to hide her surprise. Claude answered with brimming pride, stating that the harvest yield was on par with that of Rayfold, one of the kingdom's most fertile lands. In fact, he claimed that Fenris now boasted the highest production per unit area across the realm. Meanwhile, Wendy mumbled quietly in the background, recalling that it was Claude himself who once insisted that agriculture was a lost cause in Fenris. Buoyed by the discussion, Belinda broke into cheerful excitement. She declared that with support from the royalist faction, Ghislain could truly rise as a great lord. Gillian nodded in agreement, commenting that Ghislain's long-standing goal of revitalizing the territory was finally becoming a tangible reality. Yet amidst the chorus of congratulations, Ghislain alone remained untouched by the good news. While others found joy in their collective accomplishments, his expression darkened, signaling the weight of a different concern. He addressed the group with solemn resolve, stating that although Fenris had now secured its basic infrastructure and food supply, these efforts were still insufficient to withstand the looming disaster that approached from beyond the horizon. He then gave Claude a direct order to continue stockpiling food until it met his personal standard of preparedness. In addition, he called for the expansion of residential space, instructing Claude to begin acquiring new plots of land immediately. Without warning, Ghislain issued a bold proclamation, one that caught every aide off guard. From that day forward, they were to begin preparations for war. To some, it sounded like yet another one of Ghislain's infamous schemes, behavior that had earned him the nickname Northern Scoundrel. But this time, he was utterly serious. The announcement caused a ripple of confusion throughout the chamber. Fenris had only just begun to stabilize while talk of war seemed premature and unfounded. Claude voiced what everyone else was thinking. He asked Ghislain directly what he meant by that statement. From his perspective, there was no threat on the horizon. After all, Ghislain had recently joined the Royalist faction and enjoyed the protection of Marquis Branford. No one would dare move against them now, he added, with unwavering calm. Ghislain explained that Desmond or Rayfold were possible aggressors. He spoke not in speculation, but with the tone of someone who had already anticipated their next move. He advised Claude to review a particular report that would clarify the matter. As Claude took hold of the document Ghislain referred to, his eyes widened in disbelief. The contents were damning. Written was large-scale conscription efforts within Desmond's territory, ongoing recruitment of freelance mercenaries and knights, and extensive purchases of weapons and iron ore. Ghislain elaborated, stating that the report had been commissioned before his departure to the capital. He had tasked Lowell with discreetly gathering intelligence on Count Desmond's military activities. The most telling detail of all was the procurement of high-grade iron ore in bulk from the county of Cabaldi, a clear indicator of preparation for armed conflict. Ghislain voiced what many were already thinking, that the core components for any war effort are food, manpower, and weapons. He further remarked that while iron ore was essential for forging and maintaining arms, the volume and quality of the ore being purchased by Desmond far exceeded what would be necessary for peace. Unlike Ghislain, Kair reacted with visible excitement. The very idea that war loomed once again stirred something in him. He was prepared to stand and fight for Fenris with everything he had, unwavering in his conviction to go for a brawl. However, Alpoy was far less enthusiastic. Memories of the last conflict still lingered. Memories of being drained of his mana to fuel Vanessa's relentless magic. That experience left a scar, both physical and mental. Still, Vanessa remained resolute. Her eyes carried the fire of someone who refused to let any threat touch the place she had come to see as her home. As Claude read through the compiled intelligence, frustration began to mount. He noted how strategically damaging it was for Desmond to monopolize the iron ore trade. The resource wasn't just critical for war, it was key to Fenris's broader development. Given the political climate, there was no plausible scenario in which the county of Cabaldi would sell to Fenris willingly. Ghislain agreed with Claude's assessment and declared that they should treat Count Cabaldi as a confirmed ally of Duke Delphine. He reminded them all that while they hesitated and debated logistics, Desmond might already be steps ahead, fully armed and ready to strike. With the fact being laid out bare, Ghislain posed a pointed question to the room whether they could, at ease, knowing the full situation. The room fell into thoughtful silence. The reality began to settle. From this point forward, every member of Ghislain's inner circle understood the path they were being led down. This had not been a sudden decision, but something Ghislain had likely been planning all along. Claude, who had yet to experience war firsthand, began to feel the weight of uncertainty in his chest. Alpoy's mind returned once again to the agony of becoming a living mana reservoir, unsure if he could endure such a role again. Vanessa's expression, however, remained firm and composed. Ghislain stood prepared, awaiting his lord's command without question. Kair looked restless, his body itching for the thrill of battle. Belinda, meanwhile, stood in silence, her nerves returning in full force. She remembered all too vividly the image of Ghislain walking alone across a battlefield drenched in blood, and the thought made her heart ache. In truth, the aides who now stood at Ghislain's side were misfits by any measure. Some had once died early. Others lived chaotic and painful lives that ordinary people would not have survived. And yet, they were here, not because of ambition or duty, but because of loyalty, for the sake of Fenris, the home they had come to cherish. Knowing the risks, Ghislain had no intention of leaning too heavily on the Royalist faction support. As if it were the most natural decision in the world, he made his next move clear. With steady resolve, he announced that their first strike would be against the territory of Count Cabaldi, before they eventually faced off with Desmond, the feared Great Lord of the North. Ghislain continued his efforts by elevating every mercenary who chose to remain by his side, granting them the title of full-fledged knight. In parallel, he pushed himself harder through rigorous training, determined to master the immense surge of mana his cultivation had begun to generate. Meanwhile, Count Cabaldi remained immersed in his own arrogance, blind to the fact that an attack from Fenris loomed ever closer. Reclining without a care, he idly popped grapes into his mouth, unmoved even as a trusted ally delivered a direct and earnest warning. His disregard bordered on contempt. Herald Desmond arrived in person, bearing urgent news regarding Ghislain Fenris. However, Cabaldi's pride dismissed the warning without a second thought. He found it inconceivable that the newly appointed Baron could be recognized as the finest sword of the North. His confidence lay in the long-standing history of his fortress, a bastion that had never once fallen into enemy hands, and he believed it would not begin now. It wasn't until Desmond clarified that the assessment came directly from the Duke that Cabaldi paused, though only briefly. Desmond, though capable of bearing a martial title himself, had long maintained a stance of neutrality within the kingdom, concealing both his considerable prowess and his allegiance. Yet even he had come forward, carrying the Duke's judgment as a matter of grave concern. Desmond relayed the Duke's instruction to treat Ghislain Fenris, Lord of Fenris territory, as the true finest sword of the North when facing him. Desmond placed full trust in the Duke's intelligence network, which he believed surpassed even his own. He cautioned Cabaldi further, describing Ghislain as an unpredictable force, one that could not be underestimated. Preparations, he insisted, should begin immediately. Rather than heed the advice, Cabaldi expressed confusion. In his eyes, his responsibilities lay solely in supplying iron, ore, and maintaining control over the fortress. With dismissive arrogance, he questioned why Desmond would even bring such information to him, adding that it would be Desmond, recognized as the great Lord of the North, who would eventually lead the fight. Lacking the insight to grasp the broader implications, Cabaldi could not comprehend the Duke's strategic concerns. Desmond kept it simple. It was a direct order from Duke Delphine. Yet Cabaldi, mired in ignorance, erupted into laughter, blatantly disregarding the credibility of the Duke's intelligence. His voice rang with disbelief as he mockingly asked if Desmond had lost his senses since the war between Dygald and Perdium, an event Desmond himself had instigated. Loudly, he scoffed, questioning who in their right mind would ever attempt an assault on his lands. Brimming with pride, Cabaldi boasted of his double fortress wall, constructed sturdier than most and surrounded by a deep moat. He claimed that even if both Perdium and Fenris joined forces, his stronghold would stand unbroken. His confidence came not just from the castle's defenses, but from the endless iron veins beneath it and the siege weapons forged by the North's most masterful smiths. In his estimation, Ghislain would fall to madness long before daring to attack. Smugly, Cabaldi asked whether Desmond truly suggesting to bolster his defenses in anticipation of a confrontation against a mere upstart. He reiterated, with unwavering pride, that his fortress had never been breached and never would be. Wearing a crooked smile, he then turned the scorn back toward Desmond, suggesting he look to his own concerns before meddling in others. After all, Cabaldi added with venomous satisfaction, Desmond had just lost the secret weapon he once held so dear. That final comment ignited fury deep within Desmond. The remark about Victor, the gifted warrior Desmond had nurtured to one day rival the North's strongest, cut deeply. Yet despite the surge of anger, Desmond held his tongue. Cabaldi's iron supply remained far too valuable to Duke Delphine to justify any personal retaliation. Elsewhere, Ghislain had made a decisive move. Every mercenary under his command was now being trained in Perdium's mana cultivation method. Despite the peace that seemed to blanket Fenris, those who underwent the training emerged as if they had clawed their way out of hell itself. The grueling process tested their very limits. Once the final preparations were complete, Ghislain gathered his forces. The plan, long in the making, was ready to unfold. Ghislain held steadfast in his loyalty, unwavering in his resolve to serve under Ghislain. By his side, Kaer appeared notably calmer despite the impending territorial war, both of them bowing in solemn respect during the formal ceremony that bound them to their lord. Ghislain had already made his intentions clear. This war would begin by his hand. Belinda, though deeply unsettled by his resolve, knew there was nothing she could say to sway him. Fear lingered behind her gaze, but even so, she allowed the course of events to unfold without interference. Training every mercenary under his command had not distracted Ghislain from his own path of cultivation. While the 4th and 5th cores of his mana core remained just beyond reach, the moment to strike had undeniably arrived. With the full weight of his people behind him, he believed that Cabaldi could now be challenged. The belief was no longer blind. It was forged in preparation, honed through shared suffering and discipline. Every mercenary, now bearing the honor of knighthood, stood in orderly formation. Each of them had been entrusted with a sacred mana cultivation technique, one that had long enabled Perdium to endure against the brutal forces of the barbarians in the far northern territories. These techniques were not merely granted, but personally transmitted by Ghislain himself. All were uniform in gleaming black armor, their faces hardened by training, save for one anomaly, Gordon, the man, the myth, the legend. Towering beyond common stature and disliking the constraints of clothing, Gordon remained the only one unarmored, standing proudly as he was. The cultivation technique had been passed down directly by Ghislain, guided in the same meticulous manner he once used with Vanessa. That process made it impossible for the teachings to be replicated or stolen. Even if a knight were to defect, the method could not be reversed or revealed. Observing the discipline etched across the faces of his men, Ghislain allowed himself a rare expression of praise. These were no longer mercenaries. They had survived harrowing training that felt like a descent into hell, and now they stood, not just with strength, but with dignity. In that moment, Ghislain addressed them all. He spoke not of gold or war, but of trust. To set aside material gains and instead place belief in a person was no small act. They had done so, choosing to follow him across uncertainty. And he, in return, had fulfilled the vow he once made, to make every one of them into knights. Then came the final act. Ghislain drew his blade, its black steel catching the light, and with solemn finality, he drove it into the wooden stage before him. This marked the conclusion of the ceremony and the beginning of what he named the Fenris Knights Order. The declaration echoed across the gathering, and at once, 200 voices erupted into jubilation. Many of them had never dreamed of bearing the title of knight, let alone within a noble territory. Yet Ghislain had made it real. To command an army of 200 knights, all capable of wielding mana, was a feat typically reserved only for a great lord. What had begun as a reckless and ambitious plan now stood on the edge of reality. Spirits soared, but not all hearts shared the same fire. Claude sat nearby in a tent, watching the celebration, feeling stressed. Despite the complete loss of his 350 years of his life and his servitude contract for Fenris in various bet with Ghislain, his mind remained in torment. Logic and foresight warred with instinct, and he still could not fully embrace the path his lord had chosen. No matter how many times he reviewed the strategy, the idea of striking Cabaldi first refused to settle into certainty. When he turned to Wendy, hoping for some affirmation or doubt, she met him with silence. That stillness conveyed all he needed to hear, what the Lord decided would come to pass, whether they agreed or not. Months earlier, when Ghislain first unveiled the plan to launch a preemptive assault on Cabaldi, it had sparked a wave of reaction among the inner circle. If they were to wait, the Duke's faction might act first, and by then, it would be too late. A first strike gave them initiative. Many of the aides were left bewildered, unsure how such an extreme course of action had been deemed appropriate so suddenly. Claude's doubts resurfaced again in protest. His voice carried once more, demanding to know how events had escalated to this point with such velocity. Ghislain laid out the strategy with clarity, explaining that both Count Desmond and Count Cabaldi, though posturing as neutral lords, were in truth lending covert support to the ducal house. In essence, they acted as mobile chess pieces, granted freedom of movement while still aligned with the will of the ducal faction. This perception framed both men as not just political liabilities, but active enemies of the royalist faction, and by extension, enemies of Fenris. With this framing, Ghislain clarified the broader implications of victory. Should they succeed in this faction war, Cabaldi's vast reserves of iron would fall into their possession. The acquisition would not only cripple the ducal faction's access to arms, but also provide Fenris with a rare opportunity to accelerate its own development while delaying that of their rivals. Belinda, who had long abandoned the effort to sway Ghislain from this path, watched in silence. Claude, though still attempting to protest, found his arguments dissolving under the weight of Ghislain's logic. Around them, the others listened without objection, a silent consensus settling over the group. Claude, cornered by the reality of his repeated losses in wagers and debates against Ghislain, finally relented. Rather than continue the argument, he asked what the plan entailed and how they intended to make it work. It was Ghislain who spoke next, bringing attention to a harsh truth. Cabaldi's soldiers were among the best equipped in the north, outfitted with weapons forged from superior techniques and iron of unmatched quality. Kaer agreed, noting that Fenris remained inferior in both numbers and refinement. This prompted Ghislain to revisit the promise he had once made to the mercenaries who stayed with him. The vow to transform all 200 of them into knights capable of wielding mana. That vision now stood on the brink of fulfillment. It was a well-understood truth across the continent that a single trained knight could equal the strength of 100-foot soldiers. With an order of 200 such warriors, Fenris would possess the power of 20,000 men. On paper, a staggering advantage. Still, Belinda hesitated as her confusion remained visible. Mastery of mana, especially for common soldiers, required years of training and dedication. She asked whether he could make them learn that fast. Ghislain gave no verbal answer. Instead, he simply signaled toward Vanessa, who stepped forward with compliance joy. At his request, she had prepared what he needed, and she now returned with 3 large barrels, each containing tightly packed scrolls inscribed with complex magical diagrams. These were mana compression sigils, intricate magical arrays that required enormous quantities of runestones to create. Up until now, they had only been employed to enhance agricultural yields in Fenris, particularly for seed production. But their true potential was far greater, and Ghislain had decided it was finally time to unleash that dormant power on their military force. Claude's eyes widened in disbelief as he asked whether Ghislain had truly spent the entire stockpile of runestones mined from the forest of demonic beasts to produce these sigils. The answer came in the form of silence, confirmation enough. This, then, was the reason Fenris had not sold any runestones to external buyers. He elaborated further, explaining that the sigils allowed for rapid mastery of mana, even among those who would otherwise require years to awaken its flow. Though the technique deviated slightly from the standard model, Ghislain had already adapted Perdium's mana cultivation method to ease the learning curve. With the sigils acting as an aid, he estimated the mercenaries could become competent mana users within a month. Alarmed, Belinda warned Ghislain that tampering with Perdium's traditional technique without his father's consent would surely incur his wrath. However, Ghislain remained unconcerned. He had already decided that Perdium's own soldiers would be taught the same modified version. In his view, risking punishment was a better alternative than watching his men perish without ever raising a blade. Ghislain stepped in with further insight. He reasoned that simply training Fenris's forces, even with mana, would not be enough to bring Cabaldi's fortress down. Drawing from personal experience during his employment at the castle, Ghislain possessed detailed knowledge of the stronghold's defenses. His words carried the weight of memory. He described the double-layered fortress walls, reinforced far beyond ordinary stonework, protected by a deep, well-maintained moat. Defensive weapons were strategically positioned across the battlements. With such overwhelming advantages on the defender's side, it was no wonder that Cabaldi's castle had never once fallen in the family's long lineage. Ghislain added, with somber certainty, that even if every mercenary under Ghislain's command were granted knighthood and trained in mana, storming such a bastion would remain an uphill battle. A prolonged siege would still favor Cabaldi. Claude supported a different course of action, proposing that instead of initiating a strike on Desmond, they focus on containing him. His suggestion emphasized securing defensive ground while sourcing iron or from alternative regions, though he acknowledged the difficulty of such a path. However, Ghislain viewed the matter from a different vantage. He asked if Claude would be willing to stake another 10 years of his life in service to Fenris in exchange for his eventual freedom. Though Claude had lost every bet they had made in the past, he urged Ghislain not to gamble on the fate of their entire territory. With unwavering confidence, Ghislain assured him that such concerns were unnecessary. Every move he had made thus far had led to success, even if he couldn't fully articulate how he came to his conclusions. What mattered was that he always had a plan. He knew that explaining his thoughts too openly might invite doubt or disbelief, so he held back the full truth, shielding his insight to avoid being branded insane. Soon after, Ghislain summoned the entire mercenary force to the training ground. None among them anticipated what awaited. Each was about to be subjected to a grueling ordeal that would test every fiber of their being. The moment Ghislain began issuing instructions, confusion rippled through the crowd. Gordon raised a hand, voicing what many others had been thinking. Mastering mana was no short path. It typically took years of focused training before one could attain the status of a true knight. So he asked how he planned to teach them. Acknowledging their concern, Ghislain clarified that while traditional mana cultivation did indeed require several years, he had resolved to change that. He made them a promise that every single one of them would be able to wield mana within the span of a single month. A confident smile spread across his face, one that resembled a well-fed lion ready to make its move. The imminence of war required speed and certainty, and he spoke in terms simple enough for every soldier to understand. What he proposed was unorthodox, dangerous, and even rebellious, especially without the permission of his family's patriarch. Yet Ghislain forged ahead without hesitation. Despite the intricacy of the process and the fatigue already settling into his body, he pressed forward. Groans began to echo across the training grounds as the first initiations began. Even Gordon, the giant among them, hesitated. Despite his size and strength, he chose to go last, fearing the pain that came with the unknown process. As Ghislain sat behind Gordon, his mana surged and began to seep through the man's body. The process was invasive and intense, forcibly creating the channels necessary to harness mana. No one who witnessed it could believe it was a sane undertaking. The risk of fatality hung heavy in the air. Fortunately, no one had perished yet. When Gordon finally screamed in agony, Ghislain shouted back, commanding him to endure. He explained that the process condensed what would take years into mere weeks. The weight of that compression was immense, but if Gordon wished to survive, he would have to push through the torment. Ghislain directed him to focus on the sigil, one of the mana compression sigils laid out for the process, and to begin gathering the mana particles in the air. Slowly but surely, Gordon followed the instructions, beginning to spin the threads of energy into the core forming in his lower abdomen. It was an exhausting, delicate task, but it wasn't just the mercenaries who suffered. The toll on Ghislain himself was immense. Even with the experience of a past life, his mana reserves were far more limited in this one. Managing such a demanding technique across so many individuals required both mental focus and physical strength, and the effort was slowly draining him. Outside the training ground, Belinda and Lowell waited anxiously. Their concern for the young lord's well-being was visible. When he emerged, Ghislain immediately instructed Belinda to escort the mercenaries back to their lodgings so they could recover. He asked her to monitor their conditions carefully in case complications arose. Though exhausted, Ghislain refused to rest. Instead, he shifted focus to the next phase of preparation. He told Lowell to begin crafting the armor intended for the newly formed Knight Order. As he issued the order, he also inquired about the condition of the dwarven slaves who were assigned to assist. Lowell reported back with a brief update. The elves had yet to arrive, but the dwarves were already settled within the lodgings provided in Fenris territory, awaiting instructions. The news piqued Ghislain's interest, for he already understood the silent machinations the dwarves plotted in the shadows. There was no mystery in their behavior, only confirmation of what he had long anticipated. Lifting his gaze toward the night sky, he noted the absence of the moon. Darkness pressed down across the estate, thick and complete. The black void above seemed almost fitting, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Having completed the intense process of guiding the 200 mercenaries through their transformation, it was now time to turn his attention to the dwarves who had only recently arrived in Fenris. Beyond the estate's borders, cloaked within the thick forest at the rear of the territory, movement stirred beneath the soil. The dense woods were removed from the guards' usual patrols, and veiled by natural cover. Something began to emerge from underground. A sudden eruption of earth was followed by a rough, calloused hand breaking the surface. It belonged to Galberic, the leader of the group of enslaved dwarves who had been transported to Fenris. Since their arrival, their shackles had been removed, and they had been ordered to serve in the territory. But Galberic had other plans. Seeing no one in the immediate vicinity, he waved for the others to follow, certain that they had a chance to escape. For the first time in years, he believed they were on the verge of freedom. The others, however, hesitated. One of them asked if Galberic was truly sure, questioning whether freedom lay beyond the woods or if this was simply another illusion. Another dwarf mentioned the rumors of a hidden district in a neighboring kingdom, a sanctuary where former slaves of various races lived autonomously and without chains. Galberic dismissed their doubts, urging them to move quickly. He declared that the border lay just ahead, and with it, the freedom they had long yearned for. But what he saw in return was not eagerness. None of them moved. Instead, every dwarf stood frozen, paralyzed not by chains, but by something deeper. Their bodies trembled as if chilled by a force they could not name. Frustrated, Galberic pressed them again, asking why they faltered. He mocked the notion that they might be emotionally attached to the life of slavery. If they longed so desperately to remain in servitude, he said, then they might as well return and spend their lives crafting useless ornaments for the nobility. It was then that one of the dwarves answered. He said it wasn't fear that kept them rooted, but something else. Then he told Galberic to turn around. There stood Ghislain, his posture composed, his presence quiet but absolute. Despite having recently endured a grueling process with the mercenaries, he appeared refreshed, his body already cleansed of fatigue. His gaze was unwavering, fixed entirely on Galberic. Although the thought of enslaving a former friend weighed on him, Ghislain could not afford to make exceptions. In this regard, Galberic would have to be treated as Claude had been, as someone bound by fate for humanity. Calmly, he stated that running was pointless. Shock spread across the group. They could not comprehend how Ghislain had discovered their escape plan or how he had managed to catch up to them so swiftly. The realization crept into Galberic's mind only as he surveyed the forest and looked past Ghislain's silhouette. There were no guards, no soldiers, just one man standing alone. He asked whether Ghislain had truly come without any backup and without hesitation. Ghislain affirmed it. There was no need for further explanation. The group responded in the same manner the rogue mages had not long ago. Huddled close, they whispered among themselves, quickly crafting a plan. Ghislain watched as familiar expressions of rebellion and defiance took shape. When their conversation ended, their eyes rose with new intensity. Determination sharpened their gazes. Galberic stepped forward, claiming that with no other interceptor present, they could still seize their freedom by force. A small, knowing smile crept across Ghislain's face. The gesture was not born of arrogance, but of recognition. Galberic hadn't changed. He was exactly as Ghislain remembered. Accepting what would inevitably follow, Ghislain extended the unspoken challenge. He welcomed the test, prepared to subdue them himself. It would be no easy feat. Facing dwarves honed by labor and muscle was a different ordeal from his previous battle against a division of mages dispatched by the magic tower. But Ghislain felt no hesitation to teach them a lesson. In his previous life, Ghislain had endured agony with nothing but the fire of vengeance to keep him alive. In the life he now lived, that hollow thirst for revenge had changed. His strength no longer stemmed from hatred, but from an unyielding desire to protect what had become precious to him. The first shadow that loomed over his path was Harold Desmond. Both men stood at the pinnacle of northern ambition. Their confrontation was inevitable, a clash drawn by fate itself. Cunning and resolute, Harold would pursue the same goal, to claim the North for himself. And in doing so, Ghislain would become both obstacle and rival. Another force of danger carried the name Amelia Rayfold, after wrenching the Rayfold territory from her father's hands. Though her influence was still taking shape, her potential was sharp and lethal, perhaps even surpassing Harold's. Ghislain recognized that eliminating her at this stage would be unwise. Beyond them lay the Duchy faction, the most powerful political force within the kingdom. The likes of Raoul and Count Balzac had already marked him as a threat to be extinguished before his strength matured. Their attention alone was a dangerous omen. Yet even their malice paled compared to the thought of Idun, one of the continent's 7 strongest, whose might had once crushed the Mercenary King himself. In that past life, Ghislain had known firsthand the terror that name inspired. Idun would surely appear again, accompanied by the unseen master who dwelled in the depths of shadow, the one whose existence was whispered but never proven. Against such overwhelming adversaries, Ghislain would require power beyond mortal reach. For that purpose, The conquest of Cabaldi County and its rich iron mines was only the beginning. It served as a crucial cornerstone upon which his long campaign would be built. The March of Destiny demanded not only soldiers but craftsmen, and among them, one stood above all others, the legendary blacksmith Galberic. The dwarves under Fenris were still slaves, and Ghislain had just finished subduing them, making clear his authority. His treatment of Galberic, though harsh, was a deliberate act to test the pride of the race renowned for its unyielding nature. Bloodied but defiant, Galberic struggled as a testament to that pride. He would not kneel, no matter how many times he was struck down. The dwarf's refusal stirred a rare amusement in Ghislain, who found himself quietly admiring the resilience of the dwarven kind. Then, brushing the dirt from his coat, he spoke of the inevitable, how slave traders would soon come searching once word spread that their captives had fled. He questioned the reason behind Galberic's refusal to work in Fenris, expecting defiance and receiving exactly that. Galberic's response was filled with scornful conviction. He claimed that death in pursuit of freedom was preferable to living as a tool for noblemen. He swore that neither he nor his kin would forge a single piece of metal without resistance. The words carried the bitterness of years spent under human oppression, and for the first time, Ghislain sensed the weight of their resentment. He understood too well how long they had been denied the joy of creation, how their craftsmanship had withered under chains. He also knew it was too soon to show kindness, for misplaced sympathy could shatter authority before it took root. Yet in that defiance, Ghislain found admiration. As Galberic raised his bruised fists once more, ready for another round, Ghislain's expression shifted into something that bordered on pride. In that moment, he saw the reflection of the blacksmith who, the one history would remember as the legendary blacksmith. Seeing this, Ghislain made his proposition. If the dwarves would lay down their rebellion and labor within Fenris for 10 years, he would grant them freedom and establish an autonomous district. The offer was so extraordinary that silence followed. To free slaves after such a short service was unheard of, and among the long-lived dwarves, 10 years was scarcely more than a breath in time. It was an offer born of strategy, but carried a hope deeper than mere conquest. For the first time, the enslaved dwarves glimpsed a possibility for a future where their hands could forge freely once again. Galberic scoffed as he gasped for air. He dismissed Ghislain's offer as pure absurdity, claiming that no mortal could overturn the will of the kingdom. To speak of freedom granted by a rural baron, he muttered, was meaningless. To even suggest it bordered on treason, a crime punishable by death. Yet Ghislain remained utterly unfazed. His calm response was simple, but carried the weight of conviction. Laws, he said, were tools meant to shape the world, and tools could be reshaped when a need arose. The words lingered among the crowd of battered dwarves, stirring whispers of disbelief and doubt. Then one among them addressed Galberic directly. He murmured that he had heard the human noble, Ghislain Fenris, was backed by the royalist faction. Galberic's thoughts turned bitter. For centuries, the hands of his kin had been forced to craft glittering ornaments for the vanity of nobles. Dwarves valued function and strength as deeply as artistry, and every trinket made for human pride had been an insult to their craft. The thought of repeating that torment, even under a new master, made his stomach twist. Yet his pride offered little comfort against reality. To resist meant death. To obey meant surviving in chains a little longer. The world was cruelly simple for slaves like him. Ghislain recognized the struggle within Galberic's heart. He understood that the true path to earning their loyalty was not through fear, but through purpose. Blacksmiths lived for the creation of weapons and armor that bore meaning, tools that could change fate rather than merely decorate the idle rich. When he finally spoke, his words carried an understanding that caught Galberic's attention. Ghislain made it clear that he had no desire for lavish ornaments or vanity pieces. He sought something greater, something born from passion, not pretense. Galberic's guarded expression softened slightly, the flame of curiosity flickering in his eyes. With quiet conviction, Ghislain expressed his intent to create something beyond measure, something more entertaining, more ambitious than mere trinkets. For a brief instant, Galberic seemed intrigued. The notion of a human noble seeking joy in creation rather than glory or wealth felt alien, but compelling. What Ghislain described was not the greed of a lord, but the dream of a craftsman. For that fleeting moment, Galberic wondered if perhaps this man truly understood what it meant to forge. Ghislain's gaze then lifted toward the night sky, where the stars shimmered like countless sparks from an unseen forge. Memory and desire intertwined as he recalled what Galberic would one day achieve, the creation that had allowed humanity to defy even the heavens themselves. When Galberic followed his gaze, he heard Ghislain speak of a dream to soar through the skies, to craft a vessel capable of flight, a mode of travel that no kingdom of this age had even imagined. The words seemed outlandish, yet they stirred something long dormant in the dwarf's soul, the thrill of impossible creation. Ghislain's focus shifted from vision to strategy. His war preparations advanced with frightening precision. With 200 mercenaries now transformed into capable knights through his brutal training, he turned his attention to the economic front. A message was dispatched to Count Cabaldi, the proud lord who still underestimated him. The letter carried both elegance and venom, informing Cabaldi that his manipulation of the Northern Ire market had shattered fairness across the realm. If the market remained closed to Fenris and its neighboring lands, the Count would pay dearly for his greed. When Cabaldi received the message, his pride took a wound sharper than any blade. Confusion mixed with indignation as he read Ghislain's words, for in his arrogance, he still refused to believe the reports sent by the ducal house. The reports declaring Ghislain Fenris the northern finest sword. Within his grand hall, Cabaldi's vassals gathered in agitation, their voices rising in disbelief. One called the letter outrageously rude. Another insisted that Ghislain must have lost his sanity to send such a provocation. Cabaldi listened with growing irritation, then scoffed at the idea that the young baron's threats could bear any weight. Such methods, he said, only carried meaning when used by those with true power. He demanded to know what Fenris had been doing to muster the confidence to send such a piece of trash letter. One vassal cautiously spoke, reporting that Fenris had recently been buying massive quantities of food from neighboring lands, often paying well above market price to secure the shipments. Another added that the influx of immigrants sent by the royalist faction must have depleted Fenris's supplies, forcing desperate measures. One vassal seated to his right reasoned that Fenris continued to choose methods that only resulted in their own losses. Soon enough, the aide remarked, the harvest season would arrive, and with it a natural drop in food prices. Another aide, seated beside him, added that reckless actions without foresight were the hallmark of youth, a sign of impulsive arrogance rather than strategic wisdom. Cabaldi lifted Ghislain's letter toward the flame of a nearby candelabrum. He mocked Fenris, remarking that a territory which had barely recovered from ruin now sought to inflate its stature through pretentious displays of strength. Inevitably, he concluded, such desperate attempts would lead to their downfall. His confidence remained unshaken because in his mind, Ghislain would either collapse beneath the weight of Harold Desmond's advance or falter before ever reaching Cabaldi's fortress walls. The only regret that crossed his thoughts was that he would not be there in person to witness the young baron's ruin. Yet in Fenris, far from Cabaldi's laughter, Ghislain's vision stretched beyond the horizon. His preparations were no longer confined to the battlefield. Knowing what the future held, he quietly arranged for those closest to him to ready themselves. Letters were dispatched, one of them addressed to Bramford Castle and others sent to the high-ranking nobles within the royalist faction. The contents warned of a catastrophe that would soon befall the kingdom, a calamity unseen yet inevitable. Within the solemn corridors of Bramford Castle, Marquis Bramford entered his study in his usual composed manner, dressed in formal attire befitting his station. His mind was burdened with growing unease about the ducal house, whose influence and military strength had swelled with alarming speed. As he approached his desk, his eyes caught sight of something unusual, a single unopened letter resting atop the polished wood, its wax seal bearing the crest of Ghislain Fenris. The Marquis had already heard rumors of Fenris's aggressive purchase of grain across multiple territories. Though his face betrayed no emotion, he wondered whether this letter might be connected to those strange dealings. He lifted it with deliberate care and broke the seal. The message within was concise, stripped of any noble formalities. Ghislain wrote of the unnatural heat blanketing the region and warned that such weather signaled the approach of drought. The advice was simple yet urgent: stockpile food before scarcity struck. The tone was almost impersonal, ending with a curt note that those who failed to prepare would bear their own regret. It read more like a personal memorandum than a letter exchanged between peers of noble rank. Marquis Branford's brow furrowed as he reread it, his expression distant and analytical. To his pragmatic mind, Ghislain's message seemed absurd. He found himself wondering if the young baron had finally lost his senses. A warning about drought based solely on a rise in temperature. Such reasoning would be laughed out of any council chamber. In truth, no man of standing would take such words seriously. To act upon them would appear gullible, perhaps even foolish. Yet as night deepened, the Marquis found no rest. He wrestled with uncertainty, the image of Ghislain's calculated eyes haunting his thoughts. Count Aylesbury, too, had received a similar letter and had dismissed it outright, choosing to wait and see. To heed Ghislain's warning required courage and trust in a man who often defied comprehension. The first rays of sunlight crept across the marble floor, glinting against the still open letter. Marquis Branford remained in his office, lost in thought. If the message had come from anyone else, he would have tore it apart and thrown the ashes into the hearth. But the sender was Ghislain Fenris. The possibility that the young baron foresaw something others could not stirred unease within him. It was then that Rosalind entered her father's office. Concern shadowed her expression as she called to him, having heard from the servants that he had not retired to bed the previous night. The Marquis stood silently, weary yet resolute. His sleeplessness was not born of fear, but of contemplation. His instincts had rarely betrayed him, and his judgments, more often than not, had proven sound. Yet whenever the name Ghislain Fenris crossed his path, doubt followed close behind, clouding his reason. Though the skies above remained clear and no sign of drought had yet appeared beyond the oppressive heat, Marquis Branford finally made his decision. He instructed Rosalind to summon the vassals and to deliver word to the royalist nobles under his influence. His tone left no room for question. Whether Ghislain's warning was madness or foresight, he would not risk being unprepared. Marquis Branford intended to convene the nobles under his banner and hear their opinions before taking action. The matter was delicate, for purchasing grain before the harvest season, when prices were poised to fall, was a reckless gamble in the eyes of the court. If Ghislain's warning proved false, not only would Branford suffer heavy financial losses, but he would also become the subject of ridicule among his peers. Yet despite the uncertainty, something in Ghislain's words lingered like an echo of inevitability. The days following the dispatch of Ghislain's letter marked the beginning of what history would later call the Great Famine. Without fanfare or omen, the catastrophe crept upon the land, spreading quietly at first before tightening its grasp across the kingdom. At first, the reports reaching the capital were mild, mere whispers of declining yields and erratic weather patterns. In Fenris, the magical wheat continued to thrive, nourished by enchanted soil that resisted the withering touch of the sun. The people there noticed little change, and daily life continued as usual. But beyond the northern borders, the signs of decay began to appear. Fields cracked under the relentless heat, rivers shrank into dusty scars, and the once fertile farmlands of neighboring territories turned to desolation. As the weeks passed, the arid wind carried with it the stench of decay. Streams dried up entirely, and livestock perished under the merciless sun. Where once stood green fields now lay endless stretches of barren earth. Fenris, however, stood apart. Its granaries overflowed to such an extent that additional warehouses had to be constructed. In stark contrast, famine spread across other lands, turning hunger into a weapon sharper than any blade. The horror of starvation unfolded swiftly. Emaciated refugees wandered from one border to another, searching for food where none could be found. The harvest season, which should have brought celebration, instead brought ruin. Crops across the kingdom failed almost entirely, and panic consumed both peasants and nobles alike. The catastrophe was said to be the worst in 1,000 years, a calamity that shattered the fragile balance of power. Fights over food erupted across villages, cities, and noble estates. Fenris's prosperity, however, grew ever greater. The northern food supply, long absorbed under Ghislain's control, had left no surplus for the trading guilds or rival territories. Marquis Brantford, following Ghislain's advice, had stocked his storehouses well in advance, aided by Lady Muriel, who had used her private wealth to bolster their reserves. When the famine struck, their prudence proved invaluable. Both Fenris and Brantford's lands stood firm while the rest of the kingdom descended into chaos. The drought went on to etch its name into history, and only Ghislain knew it would come. His knowledge was not born of prophecy, but of experience, the echoes of a life already lived. With harvests across the realm ruined, Fenris now held enough provisions to endure for a decade. Food prices surged beyond reason, turning grain into gold. The longer the drought persisted, the wealthier Fenris became, its barns transformed into vaults of power. All across the continent, hunger stones began to appear, grim markers etched into riverbeds that spoke of suffering. Among those struck hardest was Harold Desmond. Before the drought, he had sold his remaining food reserves to Fenris at inflated prices, believing it a profitable move. Now his stronghold starved, and he had missed his chance to strike at Ghislain entirely. Amelia Rayfold, by contrast, fared better than most within the ducal house. Though she had once been humiliated by Ghislain's cunning, her sharp instincts had urged her to follow his lead. She began buying food in secret, mirroring Fenris's actions. When the drought hit, her lands weathered the storm far more comfortably than those of her peers. Count Cabaldi, however, suffered grievously. The drought ravaged his holdings, and the support promised by the ducal house arrived too late. His fury burned hotter than the sun that scorched his lands. He raged on his vassals, demanding to know which vassal had delayed Desmond's advance on Fenris. In his eyes, they should have already conquered Fenris's territories and seized its abundant food supply. The vassals, pale and hesitant, exchanged uneasy glances. One explained that Lord Desmond had ordered them to wait for better timing before making a move. Another suggested that Desmond himself had faltered, missing the critical moment due to the unexpected drought. Cabaldi's composure crumbled. Panic spread through him as he asked in desperation whether Desmond would at least send food to sustain his forces. The fortress walls could endure any siege, but soldiers could not fight on empty stomachs. Then, one vassal cautiously proposed a daring idea. They could sell their iron or to Fenris in exchange for food. Another vassal argued that such a move would be dangerous, as Fenris was aligned with the royalist faction. The ducal house would not forgive dealings with their political enemies. A third voiced agreement, insisting that patience was wiser, for Desmond and the ducal house had both promised that relief would soon arrive. Cabaldi's situation deteriorated rapidly. The requisitioning of food from his citizens had reached its limit, and the people's patience was thinning like the dust that blew across the famine-stricken land. The once proud lord now relied on military force to quell growing unrest within his domain. One of his vassals spoke during the tense council, his voice trembling as he reasoned that if their supply of military grain ran dry and the soldiers succumbed to hunger, then even the famed Cabaldi Iron Fortress, which had stood unbroken through generations, would fall to an uprising from within. For the first time, Cabaldi was forced to acknowledge the impossible. To preserve his power, he would need to lower himself before Ghislain Fenris, the young upstart he had once dismissed as an arrogant child playing lord. It was a bitter pill to swallow for one who had never bowed to anyone, yet the hunger clawing at his borders left no room for pride. Grinding his teeth, Cabaldi came to a painful conclusion. Waiting for Desmond's promised support from the north, or for aid from the ducal house, was no longer a luxury he could afford. In a final act of reluctant pragmatism, he ordered preparations to begin. They would trade iron for food, no matter the consequences. His vassals hesitated, their voices rising in anxious protest. Some pleaded for him to reconsider, fearing the wrath of the ducal house once word spread that Cabaldi had negotiated with the royalist-aligned Fenris. But Cabaldi's patience had reached its end. He dismissed their objections with disdain as he mused darkly that Baron Fenris would eventually die at the hands of the ducal house or Harold Desmond regardless. Offering a bit of iron to a doomed man, he thought, would change nothing. With his pride momentarily rekindled, he boasted to his men that should the ducal house or Desmond object to his decision, they were welcome to confront him directly at his fortress. The Cabaldi Iron Fortress, after all, had never fallen in the history of his family, and he believed none alive possessed the strength to change that. With that final declaration, he demanded that a messenger be sent to Fenris immediately to arrange the exchange before starvation consumed them all. Yet, before the order could be carried out, one of the soldiers stepped forward, hesitation visible in his eyes. He attempted to speak, suggesting there was no longer any need for the trade. Confusion rippled across the chamber. Cabaldi's expression darkened, irritation turning swiftly into disbelief as the soldier continued his report. Fenris's army, he said, was already outside the fortress gates, an entire host assembled under Ghislain Fenris's command, ready for war. For a moment, Cabaldi could not comprehend the words. The idea that the young baron, whom he had mocked and underestimated, now stood before his fortress was unthinkable. But the truth was undeniable. In the midst of drought, while his own people starved, Fenris had transformed into a realm of abundance. Fenris' black cavalry unit advanced. These were no longer the mercenaries, but fully knighted soldiers, an elite force forged through Ghislain's brutal training. Their presence alone carried a weight of dread. Tales of their exploits during the war between Perdium and Dygald had already carved fear into the hearts of nobles. Among them was Gordon, now clad in newly forged armor. Yet Gordon complained to his comrades that the armor felt too stiff and small for his massive frame, earning a sharp rebuke from Torrin, who barked that he should be grateful for the effort it took to forge such protection. Gordon merely laughed, thumping his chest with pride and boasting that mana now coursed through his body, rendering him nearly invincible. He mused aloud that not even a blade could scratch his perfect muscles, armor or not. Ghislain rode past and struck Gordon lightly in the ribs, a casual yet forceful reminder that strength untempered by humility was a liability. The blow left Gordon momentarily stunned, his confidence replaced by grudging respect. Ghislain's expression remained unreadable as he rode, musing privately about the remarkable endurance of the dwarves who had crafted their arms and armor. Training Gordon had been an ordeal because of how whiny he was, but the results spoke for themselves. Ghislain's steed rode forward with unwavering momentum, proud and seemingly invincible. Upon his horse, Ghislain rode at the front with quiet determination, his gaze fixed on the iron fortress ahead. He had yet to complete the awakening of his fourth and fifth mana cores. Time had not permitted full mastery. But preparation or not, the moment he had long anticipated had arrived, and it was time for the first post for his conquest.